The heavy iron doors of the ferry slammed shut, echoing across the freezing water.
We just stood there on the rocks, watching it disappear into the thick gray fog.
That's when the horrifying truth finally hit us.
There wasn't any construction crew waiting for us at the harbor.
No generators, no lumber, no winter supplies like we were promised.
Just a suffocating, dead silence settling over the whole island.
I looked down at my trembling hands.
I was holding this massive ring of rusted iron keys and a deed to a ruined penitentiary. Our son David bought the place at a tax auction for exactly $7. Helen was shivering right next to me in her light autumn coat. She was clutching this ridiculous little basket of gourmet cheese and crackers. Sarah had handed it to her at the docks with this big, tearful hug. At the time, we thought it was just a sweet send-off for our retirement trip. But standing there in the freezing wind, the reality of that hug chilled us to the bone. It wasn't an embrace. It was a goodbye.
The fog finally started to break, and there it was.
Blackwood Keep. This massive, rotting 19th century prison just looming over the rocks.
Its shattered windows stared down at us like hollow eyes.
We stood at the bottom of these massive stone steps leading up to the main gates. The sun was already dropping, and the temperature was plummeting fast. The ferry wasn't coming back until April. We were totally cut off from the world. No cell service, no power, no heat. Our own kids had set us out here to disappear. They figured the winter storm would do their dirty work for them. Panic is a funny thing. It didn't hit us with screaming or crying. It was just this cold, heavy dread creeping into our chests. We had no choice but to walk up those steps and go inside. I shoved that rusted key into the lock and pushed the heavy iron doors open. The metal screeched like a dying animal. Looking into that pitch-black hallway, it felt like stepping straight into a nightmare. We stepped inside and it was like walking into a meat locker. The air in there was actually colder than the freezing wind outside. Just endless rows of rusted iron cages staring back at us. Every step we took echoed like a gunshot in that dead silence. We navigated through the dark, slipping on the frosted stone floors. Finally, we found the old warden's quarters up on the second floor. The room was massive, empty and completely stripped bare. There was this huge, cracked stone fireplace, but it was totally choked with decades of collapsed mortar. Just one rotting oak desk sitting in the middle of nowhere. That first night was pure, absolute misery. We huddled together on the dusty floor, wrapped in whatever thin clothes we had. We just shivered uncontrollably while the wind howled through the broken glass. Helen just broke down and cried into my shoulder. It wasn't even the cold. It was the absolute heartbreak of it all. She kept thinking about rocking David to sleep when he was a baby. I didn't cry. I just held her tight in the pitch black. The shock started wearing off, and this deep, unstoppable anger took over. I didn't build houses for 40 years just to die in a stone cage. When the first gray light of dawn finally broke, I forced myself up. My joints were screaming from the cold, but my mind was made up. I looked down at Helen, and her lips were literally turning blue. I knelt down and took her freezing hands in mine. I looked her dead in the eye and told her we weren't gonna die here. We were gonna live, if only to spite the kids who put us here. That's when the real work started. Our biggest enemy right out of the gate was the freezing cold. Those stone walls were sucking the heat right out of our bodies. We had to get a shelter built inside the room fast. I started tearing apart anything I could find. I snapped a rusted iron leg off that old desk to use as a crowbar.
Then I went out to the corridor and started ripping up the dry, brittle floorboards for kindling.
I took one look at the massive stone fireplace and knew we had a serious problem.
The chimney was completely choked with decades of collapsed mortar and old bird nests. If we lit a fire in there right now, the smoke would just back up into the room.
It would suffocate us before the cold ever did.
There was only one way to fix it, and it wasn't going to be easy. I forced myself out of a shattered window and onto the icy slate roof of the prison. The second I stepped outside, that brutal North Atlantic wind just tore right through my coat. One slip, and I'd fall 50 feet onto the jagged rocks below. The wind was howling like a freight train, trying to rip me right off the roof. I had to press my body completely flat against the freezing slate just to keep my balance. Every single inch I crawled was a calculated risk. I was fighting the storm, the ice, and gravity all at once. My bare hands were completely numb from the biting cold. The sharp edges of the slate tiles were slicing my fingers open, but I wouldn't let go. I dragged a heavy, rusted iron pipe up that steep incline with everything I had. Pain didn't matter anymore. Only survival did.
When I finally reached the top of the chimney stack, I braced my boots against the ice.
I lifted that heavy iron pipe and just violently rammed it down into the dark opening. I struck the compacted dirt and mortar over and over again. I was channeling every ounce of my fury into those crushing blows. After hours of agonizing labor in the freezing wind, the blockage finally gave way. With a deep, hollow rumble, decades of debris plummeted down the chimney shaft. I collapsed against the stone stack, totally drained and gasping for air. I had just won my very first battle against the island. Back inside the freezing warden's quarters, I knelt in front of the cleared hearth. I had a small pile of dry, splintered floorboards ready to go. My hands were scraped and trembling as I pulled out one of our precious few matches. I struck it carefully, praying to God that it would catch. I touched the fragile flame to the dry, brittle wood. The kindling caught almost instantly, the fire spreading quickly through the splintered boards. A small, flickering orange glow began to push back the suffocating darkness of the room. It cast these dancing shadows against the crumbling stone walls. Helen just sat there watching the flames grow. The sudden warmth radiating against her freezing skin felt like an absolute miracle. That tiny fire broke the crushing despair of the pitch-black room. For the first time since the ferry left us behind, I saw a tiny spark of hope in her eyes. But our little victory was incredibly short-lived. I watched the flames and realized the old dry floorboards were burning way too fast. That wood was going to be gone in hours, and the fire wouldn't even last the night. If we were going to survive the plunging temperatures, we desperately needed insulation to trap the heat. We knew that little fire wasn't going to save us if we couldn't trap the heat. So we had to leave the hearth and head out into the main cell block. The cold out there hit us like a physical punch to the chest.
Walking through those lower tiers was like stepping into a nightmare. Just endless rows of rusted iron cages covered in thick frost.
Every step we took echoed in the dark, reminding us just how alone we really were. Down on the very bottom level, I spotted something shoved in a corner. It was this massive, rotting wooden crate buried under a pile of debris. I called Helen over, praying there was something inside we could actually use. I pried the lid off with my bare hands. Inside was a pile of old canvas tarps and thick wool blankets. They smelled like a century of mildew, but to us, it was the smell of survival.
Those old tarps were incredibly heavy and stiff from the cold. Dragging them up those stone stairs took everything we had left in us.
We didn't say a word. We just kept pulling, knowing this was our only shot.
I spent hours nailing that heavy canvas over the shattered windows. It blocked out the light, plunging the room into this perpetual twilight. But more importantly, it finally cut off that deadly, freezing wind.
Once the wind was blocked, we had to build a room within a room. I scavenged some rusted iron pipes to build a frame right around the hearth.
Helen helped me tie it all together, working right through the exhaustion.
We draped those thick wool blankets over the iron frame to make a tent.
It sealed in the heat from the fire perfectly.
It was tight and claustrophobic, but it was a sanctuary.
Inside that little tent, the temperature actually crept up to about 50 degrees. For the first time in days, we finally stopped shivering.
We had beaten the cold, and just sitting there in the warmth felt like a massive victory. But the second we stopped freezing, a new nightmare set in. That little basket of cheese and crackers Sarah gave us was completely empty. Our bodies had burned through everything, and now we were starving. The hunger became a hollow, agonizing ache. They had to find food, or they were gonna die. Beyond the iron gates, the ocean was vicious and unforgiving. They scanned the freezing water, desperate for any sign of life. Arthur scoured the ruins of an old maintenance shed. Buried under the debris, he found a rusted spool of copper wire. His hands were numb, but he forced his fingers to work. He twisted the stiff metal into crude, heavy fishing hooks. Back in the cell block, they tore into a rotting mattress. They pulled out long, strong nylon threads from the decaying fabric. Working together in the freezing dark, they braided the strands. It wasn't much, but it was a fishing line. They stood out on the slippery rocks for hours. The icy spray soaked right through their heavy layers. They dropped their lines into the deep, dark tidal pools. They waited in the biting wind, shivering and praying for a bite. For 2 agonizing days, they caught absolutely nothing. Back by the fire, the psychological torment really started to set in. The physical hunger was bad, but the isolation was worse. The silence of the prison gave them too much time to think. Every time Helen closed her eyes, she saw David's smiling face. She remembered Sarah's fake tears at the ferry dock. The betrayal was a poison in her mind, heavier than the starvation. She just wanted to lie down in the snow and let it end. On the 3rd day, their strength was fading fast. But then Arthur felt a sharp, violent tug on the line. He braced his boots against the slippery stone. He pulled back with every ounce of strength he had left. With a desperate heave, he dragged a massive rockfish onto the ice. It thrashed wildly against the freezing stone. Helen fell to her knees, weeping openly at the sight of it. It was their first real victory since being left to die. They dragged the heavy fish straight back into the jail. Arthur found a sharp, jagged piece of slate on the floor. He meticulously cleaned and prepared the fish right there. Pure survival instinct took over, their focus entirely on the meal. Back in their warm tent, they roasted the fish over the fire. The smell of the cooking meat filled the small space. That first bite of rich, oily fish was an explosion of energy. It was more than just a meal. It was life. That one meal changed everything for her. She realized crying was just a waste of water. Something cold and hard finally clicked in her head. She took over the fishing after that. Standing out on those freezing rocks for hours, totally ignoring the wind. She figured out the tides pretty fast.
She started using the fish guts to trap crabs in the tidal pools.
Her hands got quick, moving over those slippery rocks like it was nothing.
She wasn't a victim anymore. She was adapting. She even started foraging for this tough sea kelp along the coast,
Hauling heavy bundles of it right up those massive stone steps.
Every single thing she did was just about staying alive.
Back inside, she'd boil that kelp in an old iron bucket they scrubbed out with sand.
It softened up into something they could actually eat. That strict diet of fish and seaweed really started changing them.
Then December hit and brought a massive, blinding blizzard with it.
The wind was howling like a dying animal against those stone walls. The whole outside world just disappeared into the whiteout. Snow piled up fast, totally burying the lower gates. They were completely trapped inside that stone fortress.
All they could do was sit there and listen to the storm rage.
But inside, they were facing a brand new problem.
Arthur had ripped up every piece of wood he could find, and they were running out.
If that fire died, the cold was going to take them for good.
Arthur knew he had to find another way to keep them warm. He rigged up a crude torch out of a table leg and some fish fat.
He was getting ready to head down into the darkest part of the prison.
He took that torch down into the sub-basement, a place they'd been avoiding.
It was pitch black down there, just narrow, dripping stone hallways.
The smoke kicked up decades of dust, making it hard to even breathe.
He finally hits the back of that freezing basement. Right there in the dark, he finds a massive steel bulkhead door, completely rusted shut. Arthur knows a place this huge wasn't just burning scrap wood. He doesn't have a sledgehammer, so he grabs the heaviest chunk of loose stone he can find.
He starts wailing on those rusted hinges.
The sound echoes down those pitch-black hallways like a gunshot.
His hands are completely torn up and battered all over that rock.
But he doesn't even feel the pain anymore.
Every time he slams that stone, he's thinking about David, using that betrayal as fuel.
It takes 3 brutal days of hammering before the metal finally gives out.
With a horrible screech, the hinges snap.
The steel door crashes down, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. He holds the light up and actually gasps. It's a massive bunker that nobody's touched in almost 100 years.
Piled all the way to the ceiling is just tons of high-grade coal.
He drops to his knees in the dirt, letting out this crazy, ragged laugh.
He grabs a chunk of coal with his battered hands.
Out here on this freezing rock, that black stone is pure salvation. Finding that coal completely flips the script overnight. Arthur holds it upstairs and it burns incredibly hot. Their little survival tent basically turns into a sauna, finally melting the ice out of their bones. With real heat, they start boiling huge buckets of seawater. They catch the steam for pure drinking water, and it leaves behind thick white sea salt. It's a total game changer for keeping them alive. Helen takes that harvested salt and packs it onto the fish she catches. She rubs the coarse crystals into the meat so it won't spoil. She's literally building up a stockpile to survive the winter. She strings up the salted fish and hangs them right from the old prison bars. That creepy cell block turns into a massive pantry. Seeing all that food hanging there is proof they beat starvation. November bled into December, and the island was hit by a massive, blinding blizzard. The world outside just ceased to exist. It was a suffocating white blanket. Snow piled up against the iron gates, burying the lower level of the prison. We were trapped inside those stone walls. You could hear the wind shrieking through the glass like a dying animal. January and February were brutal. The sub-zero temperatures tested our endurance every single day. But inside that tent, the
The fire never went out. We kept the cold at bay. Inside that stone fortress, Arthur completely transformed. The soft edges of his retirement were just burned away by the labor. He became lean, hardened, and incredibly strong. Helen's transformation was just as striking. Her face was weathered by the salt wind, and her hands grew calloused. Her mind sharpened into this fierce, terrifying clarity. She was focused entirely on the future. By late March, the ice finally began to thaw. The vicious winds died down, and the grip of winter started to break. We had survived the worst of it. With the weather clearing, Arthur ventured out to the far side of the island. He found this ruined, standalone building out on the rocks. It used to be an old Coast Guard monitoring station. He stepped inside the dilapidated station. The place was completely gutted and exposed to the elements. But he kept his eyes peeled for anything we could use. Hidden under a pile of rotting wood, he made the most crucial discovery of all. He found a battered but intact emergency radio transmitter. It was an old military-style metal box. He inspected the vintage radio closely. The battery was completely dead, corroded by decades of salt air. But when he checked the inside, he realized the wiring was still salvageable. He knew exactly what to do. Arthur had served in the Signal Corps back in the day. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He spent 2 weeks meticulously cleaning the radio's contacts. He used canvas and pure alcohol distilled from fermented kelp. But the ancient radio needed serious power. Arthur ventured deep into the pitch-black sub-basement of the prison. He found the rusted emergency generator. With heavy tools, he cannibalized its massive battery. The generator battery was incredibly heavy. It was just a dead weight of lead and acid. It took all of Arthur and Helen's combined strength to move it. They hauled it across the thawing island on a makeshift sled. They finally dragged the sled to the ruined Coast Guard shack. It sat on the far side of the island. Inside the dilapidated structure, they set up their station. Arthur carefully positioned the massive battery next to the transmitter. With meticulous precision, Arthur connected the thick copper cables. He wired the heavy-duty battery straight to the radio's terminals. He held his breath as he flipped the main power toggle. He just prayed the ancient wiring would hold. A faint, crackling hiss suddenly filled the small shack. It was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. Arthur's hands trembled slightly as he tuned the dial. He searched the static until he caught a commercial crabbing vessel. Arthur keyed the heavy microphone. He didn't ask for a rescue helicopter, and he didn't cry for help. Instead, he spoke with a calm, chilling authority. He gave his location and specific instructions. The trap was officially set. Weeks passed, and April 14th arrived with a clear blue sky. The freezing winds were gone, and the ocean was calm. A sleek, private chartered boat cut smoothly through the water. It headed straight for Blackwood Keep. Standing on the deck of the approaching boat were David and Sarah. They were dressed in pristine, expensive dark clothes. They'd played the part of grieving children to absolute perfection. The captain was completely unaware of the truth. David clutched his expensive leather briefcase. He smiled, and all that was in there was just relief. Inside the case were pre-filled death certificates. He believed the nightmare of his debt was finally over. All they had to do was retrieve the bodies. The boat finally pulls up to the island's jagged edge. David and Sarah step off onto the rocks, pulling their expensive coats tight against the chill. They're putting on this whole fake grieving act, fully expecting to walk into a frozen tomb. They start walking up that winding stone path
toward the massive prison.
They're bracing themselves for this dead, frozen silence. Every step they take is just bringing them closer to what they think is a massive payout.
But as they get to the main courtyard, David just stops dead in his tracks.
The heavy iron gates aren't swinging in the wind anymore.
They've been completely repaired and tied back with these thick braided ropes.
The whole courtyard is completely transformed.
All that chaotic debris from October is just gone.
Instead, there are these massive, perfectly neat stacks of chopped driftwood and black coal everywhere.
It's obvious someone has been doing some serious heavy labor.
David looks up at the towering stone walls.
Right there, coming out of the warden's quarters chimney, is a thick, steady plume of gray smoke. It's this undeniable, terrifying sign of life in a place that was supposed to be a tomb.
Sarah grabs David's arm, digging her fingers right into his suit. Her eyes go wide with this sudden suffocating panic as she realizes what that smoke means. That whole entitled, composed act she had on the boat just shatters in a second. Before either of them can even say a word, the heavy oak door of the main block groans open. It swings wide, and two figures step right out of the darkness and into the blinding spring sunlight. They don't look anything like the frail victims their kids left behind. They look like hardened pioneers.
Arthur is standing tall, casually holding this heavy iron bar, and Helen is right beside him, her eyes just burning with this fierce, terrifying clarity. David's jaw just drops.
All the color completely drains from his face, making him look sick in that expensive suit. He takes this stumbling, cowardly step backward. His brain is just totally short-circuiting at the sight of his parents standing there, looking so powerful.
Pure desperation takes over, and David tries to recover.
He stammers out this pathetic, totally transparent lie, his voice actually cracking. He tries to claim they came back, that the contractors betrayed them, and that they thought their parents were dead.
Arthur didn't even raise his voice.
He just walked slowly down those stone steps, holding that heavy iron bar like it was an extension of his own arm.
He stepped right up to his trembling son, looking him dead in the eye.
He didn't scream. He didn't curse. He just looked at the boy he raised with this quiet, lethal kind of power.
He told him straight up, "The contractors didn't betray us, David. You did."
That's when Sarah completely lost it. She stepped forward, crying these big, ugly tears, reaching out for her mom like a scared little kid.
She started begging, swearing it was all just some huge mistake.
But Helen didn't even flinch. She just stared at her daughter with eyes like absolute ice. She didn't offer a single ounce of comfort. She just told her, "Don't touch me. You don't have a mother anymore." David was in full-blown panic mode now. His brain was just scrambling for a way out of this nightmare. He pointed down at their fancy boat, begging his dad to just get on board so they could all go home. Arthur actually smiled, but man, there was zero warmth in it. It was the smile of a guy who beat the Reaper and knew it. He looked right at David and said, "We are home. But you've got nowhere to go." Then Arthur dropped the hammer. He told them all about the radio and the call he made to his lawyers weeks ago. He'd liquidated the entire estate, cut them off completely, and, oh yeah, the cops were waiting for them back on the mainland. The reality of it just crushed David completely. His legs literally gave out from under him. He collapsed right there on the cold stone, burying his face in his hands, knowing his life was officially over. Sarah just stood there, frozen, sobbing uncontrollably. All that fake, expensive vanity was completely gone now. She finally realized that her own greed had just cost her absolutely everything she ever cared about. Arthur didn't say another word. He just turned his back on them,
took Helen's hand and walked away.
They left their kids right there in the dirt, heading back into the stone fortress they'd conquered together.
They stepped back across that threshold, leaving the world behind.
When those heavy iron doors slammed shut, it wasn't a prison anymore. It was their sanctuary. Walking down those dark corridors, the fear was completely gone. Every rusted bar and cracked stone belonged to them now.
They weren't victims waiting to freeze in the dark.
They were the masters of this place. Back in the warden's quarters, the fire was still roaring. That pile of black coal, it had been their absolute salvation.
Sitting by the hearth, they finally let out a breath.
They had actually done the impossible. It didn't take long for the mainland police to show up.
Arthur's radio call had set the whole thing in motion.
The authorities came, cutting through the water, lights flashing.
The trap was officially sprung. The officers stepped onto the docks, looking strictly down to business. They marched right up that stone path to the courtyard.
David and Sarah were still just kneeling there in the dirt.
They were too stunned to even try running.
They hauled David up and slapped the cuffs on him.
That expensive tailored suit was covered in dust and grime. His whole slick, arrogant routine was completely gone. He knew his life was over.
Sarah couldn't even walk straight as they led her away.
Her designer coat was dragging on the rocks, her makeup totally ruined. She took one last look up at that massive stone fortress, the place she thought would be their grave.
The police boat fired up its engines and pulled away from the island.
David and Sarah sat in the back, heads down, totally defeated.
They were heading back to face the music. And they were never coming back. Up on a high slate roof, Arthur watched them go.
The wind was whipping his coat, but he stood like a statue.
He had protected his wife and beat the impossible odds. He had claimed his kingdom.
Helen climbed up to join him, wrapping her wool shawl tight.
They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the water. They weren't those soft retirees anymore. They were the unbreakable pioneers of Blackwood Keep.
They climbed down from the roof, their steps steady and completely in sync.
Moving through those upper corridors, the heavy stone walls didn't feel oppressive anymore. The place that was supposed to be their grave had actually become their home. Out in the courtyard, the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the gates they'd fixed themselves. Arthur checked the thick ropes holding the iron in place, a real testament to all that back-breaking work.
Those massive piles of wood and coal stood there like monuments to their survival.
Back inside the main cell block, the whole vibe had shifted from terrifying to triumphant. Lines of nylon thread still hung between the rusted bars, loaded with salt-cured fish. Helen walked down that dark hall, touching the cold iron like she owned the place. They headed back to the warden's quarters, the warm, beating heart of their whole setup. Arthur grabbed his iron bar and stoked the massive fireplace, sending sparks flying up the chimney. That roaring coal fire threw a deep, comforting glow across their canvas tent. Helen sat by the hearth, picking up a makeshift bone needle and some scrap canvas. She started mending a tear in one of their heavy blankets, her hands moving with this practiced, easy grace. There wasn't an ounce of fear left in her eyes.
Arthur sat across from her, pulling that heavy, rusted ring of keys out of his pocket.
He turned the ancient iron over in his rough hands, really feeling the weight of it. These weren't the keys to a prison anymore. They were the keys to their own kingdom. As evening rolled in, the wind started howling again, battering the outside of the keep. But inside their little room within a room, the freezing cold couldn't even touch them. They shared a simple meal of roasted fish and kelp, and it tasted better than any fancy dinner they'd ever had. The next morning, they were right back to their grueling but life-saving routine.
Arthur stood out on the jagged rocks, letting the icy spray soak his boots without flinching. He cast his crude copper hook into the gray water, standing tall and totally unyielding against the tide. Further down the beach, Helen navigated those slippery tidal pools like a seasoned pro.
She gathered up tough, edible kelp, tossing it into her bucket with quick, deliberate moves. The harsh island that used to terrify her was basically just her backyard garden now.
They met back at the bottom of the stone steps, their daily harvest totally complete.
Looking up at the massive silhouette of Blackwood Keep, those shattered windows didn't look like hollow eyes anymore. They'd survived the ultimate betrayal and built an unbreakable life in their $7 tomb.
By late March, the brutal ice finally started to thaw.
The vicious winds died down to a manageable breeze.
So Arthur was exploring a ruined Coast Guard station on the far side of the island when he found it.
Sitting on a rotting desk inside the shack was a battered emergency radio transmitter.
It was a heavy metal box, totally corroded by salt air. But the internal wiring actually looked salvageable. Arthur served in the Signal Corps back in his youth, so he knew exactly what he was looking at.
He hauled the heavy device back to their shelter.
They quickly realized the battery was completely dead.
Refusing to give up, Arthur spent 2 solid weeks meticulously cleaning the delicate contacts. He used a rough piece of salvaged canvas and pure alcohol distilled from fermented sea kelp to scrub away the grime. To power the transmitter, they needed a massive energy source. Armed with their crude torches, they ventured back down into the pitch-black sub-basement. They had to cannibalize the heavy-duty battery from the rusted emergency generator.
That generator battery was incredibly heavy, requiring all of their combined strength to move it.
They loaded the massive block of lead onto a makeshift sled, hauling it across the rocky terrain back to the radio.
Back in the shelter, Arthur carefully connected the thick copper cables from the massive battery to the radio.
Helen watched with bated breath as he took a deep breath and flipped the heavy toggle switch. A faint, crackling hiss suddenly filled the room. It was the most beautiful sound they had heard in months. Arthur's calloused fingers trembled slightly as he tuned the dial, catching the faint transmission of a crabbing vessel. Arthur keyed the microphone, but he didn't cry for help. Speaking with a calm, chilling authority, he gave his exact location, followed by a very specific set of instructions to relay to his personal attorney. The trap was set. Weeks later, April 14th arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky. A sleek, private chartered boat cut through the calm ocean, carrying David and Sarah, who were playing the part of grieving children to perfection. The boat finally docked at the rocky harbor. David and Sarah stepped off, pulling their expensive coats tight against the chill. They walked up the stone path, fully expecting to find a frozen graveyard.
But as they hit the main courtyard, David stopped dead in his tracks.
The heavy iron gates weren't broken anymore. They were repaired and tied back, and the courtyard was filled with massive, neat stacks of chopped wood and coal.
Sarah grabbed David's arm, her eyes wide with sudden, suffocating panic.
A thick, steady plume of gray smoke was rising right out of the warden's chimney. Before either of them could even say a word, the heavy oak doors swung wide open. Arthur and Helen walked right out into the sunlight. They didn't look like victims at all. They looked like hardened pioneers. Arthur was gripping a heavy iron bar, standing tall and broad.
Helen was right beside him, her eyes burning with this fierce, terrifying clarity. David's jaw just dropped.
All the color drained right out of his face as he stumbled backward. He started stammering out this pathetic lie, claiming they tried to come back and the contractors had betrayed them. Arthur didn't yell. He just walked slowly down those stone steps, the iron bar resting in his hand, radiating this quiet, lethal power.
He looked right at his trembling son and told him the contractors didn't betray them. David did.
Sarah started crying, stepping forward to reach for her mom, begging and saying it was all a mistake. But Helen didn't even flinch. She looked at her daughter with absolute ice and said, "Do not touch me. You have no mother."
David tried to recover, pointing at the boat and pleading with them to just go home so they could sort it out.
Arthur just smiled this cold, victorious smile. He told David they were already home and that David had no home to go back to. Arthur finally revealed the trap. He told them about the radio, the canceled insurance, and how he liquidated the entire estate into a trust they could never touch.
Oh, and the police were already waiting at the mainland docks.
David just collapsed to his knees in total defeat. Arthur turned his back on them. He took Helen's hand, and without even looking back, they walked right through the heavy iron doors of the keep. They left their kids kneeling in the dirt. They were sent to a $7 tomb to die. But instead, they built a fortress.